I'm now going to go straight to Robert Delner, who's going to talk about the man who this event is literally dedicated to. Can I please invite Robert Delner to take himself off mute and to go straight into explaining why this event is dedicated to the man that it is dedicated to. Robert, thank you very, very much, sir. Brilliant to have you with us. And thank you for what you're about to say. And I say that on behalf of every other person who is on this session. Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. And yes, of course, it's also with great sadness that we heard of the passing of Paul Moore. Paul, many of you will know as the H-Boss whistleblower. And I wasn't going to, or I'm not going to speak much about Paul's career. It's well recorded, both in the press and also in his book, Crash Bank Wallop, that came out in 2015. What I would like to talk about is Paul's life, and also as a great friend, I believe, how he impacted not only me and others, but also the industry as a whole. So we remember Paul and also his family, his wife, Maureen, and his children, Emily, Daniel, and Oliver, at this time. So Paul, who you know, worked for H-Boss, came into H-Boss in 2002, and essentially as the group head of risk and compliance, found that there was misdemeanors happening, in his opinion, in the sales department in particular, around sales tactics, etc., and customer dealings. So he went to the board and subsequently was fired, which is well recorded, on the 8th of November 2004 by the then CEO, James Crosby. However, Paul is a very devout Christian. He's a Roman Catholic. He's deep in his faith. And he then entered into a significant period, really, of reflection and contemplation. What am I supposed to do here? He felt, I believe, a very immense conflict between his work, but also his loyalty to his family, his friends, and to the industry, and to his faith. But one day he heard Joyce Meyer say on the radio, "You will not defeat Goliath with your mouth shut." And this really gave him a final prompt and also a conviction that he had to respond to this challenge on his conscience and effectively blow the whistle. Following his whistleblowing, Paul suffered really significantly, both personally and his family. He became pretty much shunned by the city, lost many of his friends and colleagues that he thought would stand by him through this period. Felt quite depressed over a long period of time. And he started fighting the system, so to speak, from his perspective. Again, well documented is his journey through the House of Commons Treasury Committee, where he made his submission, which then led to Crosby resigning and surrendering his knighthoods, etc. But while this felt for Paul as some form of indication, he continued to work really for transparency and a higher level of standards and ethics within the industry. He took part in many reform initiatives. He was part of the Whistleblower UK and even started this movement called the New Wilberforce movement. But at the same time, Paul was also fighting bravely his inner demons. He was, and is publicly has said that he was an addict, he was an alcoholic. And he was also suffering from bipolar and depression. And when faced with particularly a couple of low points, he did contemplate ending his own life. This was summarized in his book, Crash Bank Wallop, the memoirs of the H-Boss whistleblower, published in 2015. And what I would like to say about Paul as a friend is that he managed to deal with this situation in a very respectful way. He had come to some form of reconciliation at the end of this period, and he retired a couple of years ago in relative peace and enjoyed his cycling, enjoyed his family, spent time with them. And they said to me quite recently that he found these last couple of years to be very happy and free of the thoughts and issues that have previously sort of affected him. Paul will always be remembered as a highly intelligent, very loyal, courageous, forthright, principled, and very humorous person by all his friends and those who were close to him. He has no doubt had also his demons, but he fought them openly, courageously, and bravely, while also through this shadow element of him, which we all share, by the way. This was also part of his character, and it was a strong character, but with his faith in God as well, gave him a strong personality and an insatiable will to do the right thing for all of us and for the industry. And that is how I will remember my friend Paul. Rest in peace, Paul. Thank you for your contribution. Sorry.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert. It's obvious what that meant to Robert. It's obvious what good Paul Moore has done for the sector by standing up and doing what he did. I know there are several people on this session today. There are several people on this Zoom session who can directly relate to, on a completely human level, what Robert has just explained. And there's at least a couple of people on this Zoom meeting tonight who are bloody impressive just for still being here, given what they've put up with over the years. And some of that might come out during the course of the session. So I guess these are the key points. Thank goodness there are some folk around like Paul Moore who understood. I'm going to read out the quote that Robert just made. You will not defeat Goliath with your mouth shut. I mean, in a way, we don't kind of need to say more than that. What we need to do is learn how to speak collectively, cohesively. Each one of us has a tiny, insignificant voice. But if we find out how to work collaboratively and to say the same kind of thing in the same kind of way, it will be impossible. It will be impossible for us to be ignored. And considering how few people there are in the banking sector who have the kind of mindset and frankly rotten values that leads the sector to behave the way it does, and it is a really, really small minority. Yeah, it is a really small minority. We might be tackling a great big giant of a Goliath, but there are loads of us. Yeah, for a start, there's 2,764 people in the Transparency Task Force, but there are millions of people around the world who want the banking sector to change. Another phrase I'd like to draw upon tonight is progress begins with realism. Progress does begin with realism, and that often is about having the guts to accept the realities of where we are right now. And I'm quite confident I'm right when I say that essentially all that has really happened over the last 10, 11, 12, 13 years of supposed banking reform, all that's really happened has been a cosmetic marketing PR exercise. I nearly swore then, I'm glad I didn't. The fundamentals haven't really changed. And that's why we're doing all we can do with politicians, with regulators, with policymakers, to help them to open their minds up to the realities of the situation, which really does normally change. In respect for Paul Moore and in respect for Robert Delner, I'm not going to invite you to applaud Robert for what he said. It just wouldn't feel quite right. But I am going to invite us just to spend a few seconds in peace, having a conversation with ourselves about what we're thinking right now. Let's all just take 20, 30 seconds to do that. Forgive me if you feel it, if you think it feels a bit, I don't know, weird doing that, but in this day and age, we don't often get a chance to have a few moments to reflect and be peaceful. Let's take the opportunity to do that and just have a conversation with ourselves or whoever we want to speak to in our mind's eye, and just reflect on the importance of what we're trying to do and the authenticity with which we are trying to do what we're trying to do. Thank you, Robert. We're going to go straight to our next speaker. We're going to go straight to Mr. John Martin, who, by the way, has very kindly helped us by sponsoring this evening's event. John, please share with us your thoughts. You might want to kick off with any reflections you have on what Robert's been saying so far, or indeed what I've been saying so far. But in terms of your actual session, as you know, it's like 8, 9, 10 minutes or so. Hopefully we'll have a bit of time for Q&A after that. Can I invite John Martin to speak, please? Thank you very much indeed, John. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andy, and very, very distinguished guests, and of course, very privileged to be able to share my passion here tonight. I think, Andy, there's one thing I will say: your passion shines right through, just in terms of what we're trying to do. And yeah, I think the famous saying, "Where there's a will, there's a way." Really resonates with with what we're trying to achieve. So yes, very much so. And I do know HBOS. I was actually with Lloyd's Banking Group, and we bought HBOS not that many years ago. So I do know the situation there, and very very poignant remarks made and thoughts made. So really absolutely fantastic bunch of people to be able to share my passion as well. And of course, just to be able to support the sponsorship of this event is really grateful for that. Andy, do you want to? I mean, I've got a PowerPoint presentation. Do you want to make me the host, if that's the way to go?
It is the way to go. Please do. I think you've got access rights to share your slides now, please, John. Thank you very much indeed.
Should have that. Yeah. And again, I will try and be as quick as possible. I know timing is always a bit of a challenge in these sorts of events. And of course, 8, 9, 10 minutes is quite short. I could talk for hours and hours, but unfortunately, we don't have that opportunity. Again, it's I'm the CEO and founder of Plutus Consulting Group, and very pleased to obviously be partnered with TTF on fixing banking. I thought I would show that picture in the front screen there with the policeman. Of course, the rule of 10 being a bit difficult to enforce in that situation, but I think it's quite poignant to realise, and we'll come back to that picture at the end, is that banking is always going to be a bit of a challenge. And I do resonate with the thoughts that Andy, you mentioned in terms of what the banking has done and the way that the sector's behaved. I just thought a little bit of housekeeping just to start off in terms of Chatham House rules apply. Again, everybody's aware of that, so let's make sure that we follow that. Material is copyrighted with a disclaimer.
John, forgive me, John, I'm going to interrupt you, and forgive me, this is entirely my fault, okay? Entirely my fault. We never go anywhere near Chatham House rules, okay? It's an anathema to us, okay? We believe in transparency, which means we want to encourage people to say what they think, and we want people to say what they think in a manner where they can share it with the whole world. The reality is these days, everyone's a journalist because of social media. So please only share what you are comfortable sharing. If you need to adjust your presentation accordingly, please do.
No problem, Andy. Thanks very much. Excellent. Again, just to mention that the material is copyrighted with some disclaimers. So obviously Plutus does a lot of hard work in the background, and again, it's as interactive. I think it's quite clear that the interactivity is quite important. So really just wanted to start off with what we're trying to cover here tonight is my ex-boss, actually, Bob Diamond, looking a little bit worried. That was him coming out of the one of the press conferences and financial committee rooms. That folder that he's got under his arm is actually a folder I prepared for him as I worked for him for a number of years. But I do like the picture because you've got somebody with a glass of, it looks like a champagne, well, it's a champagne glass, on the left-hand side. I'm not sure whether it was offering him a toast or asking him to put some money in the tin, because Bob Diamond had a real reputation for being, let's say, one of the bankers that maximised the system to the nth degree. And again, I just thought I'd share that with you, the policeman looking a little bit perplexed as well, wondering, you know, in how this could all happen. But yeah, so really, I just wanted to share that as a starting point. We covered some of the Plutus and Transparency Task Force in terms of what we, you know, what we're trying to do together. A bit of background there. I'm going to sort of say what went wrong and try to, you know, put something forward. I'm going to attempt to show a small video just on the financial crisis and the view of the New York Fed. Quite an interesting slant on things in terms of what they said, and this is going back a bit. But I think the realization that that banking and the challenges that banking faced in terms of where it was during the financial crisis was a little bit in its own situation with the fact that you know, banking has always been seen as a safe, stable type environment. I knew when I started 30 years in banking myself that it was going to be a very safe environment, and I could retire quite happily. And then I'm going to ask the question, what needs to be fixed in terms of that? So just really, Plutus Consulting Group, I'm not going to harp on this. I mean, you know, I can share the slides at any point, but you know, we're quite well established. We do a lot of mergers, acquisitions, a lot of regulatory and compliance programs, and we do actually are now venturing into sustainable investment, which is an exciting new venture for us. And again, most of you are well versed in the Transparency Task Force and what they do and the wonderful work that they do as a group. So a little bit of an interesting fact, actually. Always start off with a bit of thought process here. The oldest bank in the world, actually 1472. So in Italy. I do like the comment at the bottom there, is to offer loans to poor or miserable or needy persons. I thought that's quite a nice way to end off a sentence. But I thought I'd look at the oldest bank in the UK and really want to make the point that you know, it's 200 years later. You've got a bank that's still in operation today. It only has a number of 2 locations. It's been very successful. It's never been fined in its entire operation, and still very much run on old-fashioned principles and basic principles that most of us, I think, in the room are going to be able to resonate with. So 200 years later, oldest bank in the UK. Moving on to evolution of banking, and I always ask the question whether that's good or bad. As we all know, that you know, banking has evolved over many years. The way that we bank has radically changed, and I think the key point here is really to understand that banking has become less personal and a lot more automated, primarily driven by cost. In one factor, but again, you know, you could have a different opinion on that. For me, the simplified functionality is still missing. We tend to overcomplicate things that we don't necessarily need to do. So really just wanted to sort of bring that to the fore. Main message I really want to bring across there is that that sort of personal touch has now gone. It's become a lot more faceless, a lot more automated. You're talking to machines, and I think there's quite a despondency against that. Operating a bank is quite complicated. I've been involved in banking for many years, and I know that you know, there's one situation here that is really a thought process for most of us, is that actually one individual can have a multitude of relationships with just one bank. You know, you can be a customer, you can be a lender, you can have a mortgage, you can even work for the regulator, you can be a shareholder, and that's actually quite a difficult relationship setup to be able to manage. And yes, I mean, it is complicated, and it has become a lot more complicated, particularly on the regulatory side. What has gone wrong? First of all, I think regulator failure, and we tend to always sort of look at our regulators and expect them to be squeaky clean, but the focus has actually been on the impact of the bank and not on the customer. That has started to change over the last couple of years, where the FCA in particular has started understanding that the customer is key, and therefore the understanding of customers, the way that they're treated, the fairness, etc., has become a lot more important. But prior to that, it's really been, if there's been a failure, it's been very much based on how the bank has not performed. Data breaches and fines, insufficient to penalise, and the lack of lessons learned, I think, is very appropriate. If we look in the UK, the level of our fines are way insignificant to the level of fines that, for example, the SEC in across the pond impose. Data breaches, you can't even pick up a newspaper or go onto the internet these days without some data breach having occurred, data going missing, you know, and regulations like GDPR, etc., don't always help, because it doesn't seem to be that people are actually solving the issues, solving the problems, and understanding how they can rectify things that have gone wrong. One of the big aspects is that remuneration and the risk and reward mechanisms are completely out of touch with the real world. Rewarding of failure is never going to work, in terms of the fact that, I mean, my ex-boss, and I don't mind telling you, he took over £100 million a year in salary and benefits. I mean, for one individual to be at that sort of level is absolutely crazy. Even looking at it from somebody who's in professional football, I mean, you know, the kind of remuneration that is paid out to some of the banking executives is completely out of this world. Risk control and governance failure. There have been a number of failures in this area, in where, you know, people have taken shortcuts. The element of greed is always going to creep in. We've alluded to the level of performance and ability to be able to get the numbers has always been an incentive to, you know, for people to cut corners and not necessarily do a complete 100% review of any of their risks. Control and governance aspects. And again, just to bring in the example there, the TSB IT platform transfer was actually quite diabolical in terms of the understanding that we're not going to do a full testing of that platform. We're just going to implement it and put it into live. I mean, that kind of approach is in a live banking and operational system is quite mind-blowing to understand. So I've just given a flavor there in terms of what I think has gone wrong. Libel, what a scandal. Most people will remember Libel. Again, Bob in the top corner there, looking very worried again. Individual that's currently about to be released from an open prison, if you can consider that to be prison, is one of the individuals, in fact, the only individual that was caught. But the libel scandal, I was actually involved in the middle of that, and it is and was probably one of the biggest scandals. As we know, libel is being transitioned at the end of next year, no longer going to be operational. So yeah, very, very interesting point in terms of that. I was actually part of the problem, just to give a personal aspect of it. That is actually a picture of myself flying around the world. I never did take my clothes off in the bottom left-hand corner. That was somebody's poetic license. But yeah, I was part of the problem. I'm prepared to admit that I was caught up in the rat race of you know, performance numbers, trying to achieve goals that really didn't take the customer or the investor into account. I thought I'd show this video if I've still got time, Andy. I'm looking at the clock just to keep that keep focus.
Yep, that's fine.
Unprecedented. The scenes of one of the biggest bailouts in American history.
It was, I've got to play because everybody else is playing, otherwise I'm going to lose. And so it was go, 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 and then the hammer came down. I think the financial crisis, you know, hit at a time when some financial firms, you know, were not in a good place in terms of the decisions that they were making. It seems that for some of these firms, making money was the objective. rather than taking care of your customers and clients and doing what was right for the customer. Some financial services in general might have lost sight of all of the stakeholders, even shareholders, you know, in the decisions that they made. I think one of the telling quotes from the crisis was about the music playing, and we got to keep dancing until the music stops. The culture there was one where the business on the front line was the one calling all the shots, even though you had your second and third lines of defense coming in and saying, you're building a risk here. There seemed to be awareness that risk was building up in the system, and yet nobody was willing to take that first step off. So it was, I've got to play because everybody else is playing, otherwise I'm going to lose. And so it was go, 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 and then the hammer came down. Question is, you know, going forward, are we going to see the change in behavior as a result? And I think that's what firms will start to try to measure going forward. One of the things that most firms have started with in terms of trying to address their own internal cultural and behavioral issues is defining what they want. And so many firms have gone back and restated their values. Sometimes they've come up with new ones, sometimes they have recast the ones they have, but that's often been the starting point, is saying, what do we want? Second point is trying to figure out, what do we have? And most firms have instituted, if they didn't already have them, have instituted employee climate surveys. So it's both assessing where we are today and then it's defining where they want to go in the future. Many firms have started culture programs. They may call them something else, but it really is about the internal workings of the firm. The Dutch Central Bank has developed a great program using an array of experts, but those who are expert psychologists.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for that. I mean, I just, in the interest of time, I'm just going to finish off the presentation, if that's okay, Andy.
Yeah. If you can wrap up in about 30 seconds or so, nice and succinctly, that would be perfect, John. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. Just to briefly rush through this, again, always timing a challenge, is what needs to be fixed. And I think, you know, we can really understand the culture and the change in diversity. Sarah brings it out quite strongly in that last video that we just watched. Customers first, people over profit, right? So fundamental in terms of in terms of what they, you know, what we need to achieve. Collaborative innovation, but not at all costs. We can innovate, but you know, we need to understand what banking needs to do and the services it needs to perform, and again, customer first. A core strategy based on the purpose, pride, and passion. I mean, you know, we've mentioned the word passion a couple of times here tonight, so really important to be able to bring that to the fore. Data breaches and fines need to connect with ownership. In other words, if there is a data breach, somebody needs to be responsible and accountable, because, you know, just paying out a fine from a financial institution, it just impacts the shareholders and the value in the bank. They just take it out the balance sheet. So, you know, it really needs, people need to be responsible and accountable. And again, an appreciation of loyalty. I think, you know, we need that realization that we are, after all, humans. So really important to understand those concepts. Breathe for any questions, and I can take anything that you want. Sorry for a slight overrun there, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us so clearly. And the video is well worth watching. When we circulate the slides and the notes afterwards, we'll obviously ensure that everybody has a link to that video that John started showing there. John, thank you very much indeed. In actual fact, what we're going to do is we're going to move straight on. Otherwise, we're going to be a little bit too far behind time, John, if that's okay with you. But we are hopefully going to have some time later in the event for Q&A more generally. And of course, you're all very welcome to connect with John or each other. In fact, I encourage you all to please put your contact details, for example, your email address, your LinkedIn link, or whatever you want to put into the chat. One of the really valuable things we do within the TTF is we connect people quite literally around the world. And we are one of those communities where the sum is greater than the parts. You know, there is value in collaboration. There's value in aggregation. That's what we're all about. So please make yourselves connectable by providing your contact details in the chat. John, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to invite us all to applaud John for his session. The way that we do this, by the way, in TTF land is a bit of a tradition. Just go with it, even if you may not want to. Just wave. That's what we do. We wave like this to show our appreciation for the speaker, because you can't really applaud on Zoom. It just doesn't work. So this is our way of saying thank you very much indeed to John Martin, not just for the session, but also for helping to sponsor tonight's event. John, thank you very, very much indeed. I've just put the word secretariat into the chat. The reason I've done that is this. We've already got the secretariat sorted for the all-party parliamentary group on pension scams. I think we've got about 20 people involved with it. We haven't yet got the secretariat sorted for the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services. So if this matters to you and you want to be involved, just volunteer, just put the word secretariat into the chat, and that will be our way of knowing that you want to know more information. You're not making a hard commitment. It just be my way of making sure we follow up with you and let you know what that would actually mean in practical terms. In plain English, it would mean that you would help to run the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services. Okay, thank you very much.
How do you think that would affect our involvement in the industry professionally?
That's an interesting question, and I'll leave you to ponder that, and it can become a talking point later on. We're due to finish at 8, but I will be keeping the channel open to 8:30 for what we call our fireside chat, and that's is exactly the kind of question we might want to deliberate at that time. What we're going to do now, though, is we're going to go straight to Prem Seeker. I've known of Prem for years and years and years. Prem is known to be an extremely bright, insightful, intelligent, analytical agent for positive change within the system, and is also, as some of you will know, recently become a peer as well. So I'm very, very pleased to have Prem with us today. It's a privilege, frankly, to have Prem with us. Prem, thank you so much for taking some time out of your notoriously busy schedule to spare some time with us. We are tight for time, Prem. If you can squeeze whatever you're about to say into 8, 9, 10 minutes, that would be great. Over to you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andy, and it's my pleasure to meet all the kindred souls which have gathered in this virtual room. And let me begin, first of all, by really thanking Robert for his tribute to Paul Moore. I had the pleasure of meeting Paul and also speaking to him on many occasions, and we discussed all kinds of reforms, not only of banking, but also accounting and auditing, which are quite central to what happened at the banking crash, and indeed his run-in with KPMG as well. What I'm going to say may well overlap with what some other speakers might say, and John might already have said, but I think it was very apt, Andy, that you began by drawing our attention to a multi-headed monster, and actually that is what we really have to attend to if we're going to tackle the banks. So I'm going to talk some of these multi-heads and what we may or may not be able to do about them. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the UK suffers from what we might call a finance curse. People often talk about a resource curse for developing economies and how that has made them poor. And the finance has actually made UK poorer. One study carried out by my colleagues at Sheffield University estimated that between 1995 and 2015, the UK finance industry made a negative contribution to the UK economy of £4.5 trillion. Okay, and if you think about it, obviously thinking about the various banking crashes, various scandals, mis-selling of anything and everything, involved in money laundering, involved in tax avoidance, diversion of scarce economic resources to the finance industry. Therefore, there is an opportunity cost. So I think in a sense, we have to really start looking at this sector beyond this boast that it is really, really contributing. We really need to look at some alternative numbers, alternative matrices, and that is important. This sector is entirely reliant upon the state, or mainly reliant upon the state. And that is an important point to realize. For example, state has decreed that the interest rates be low, and that means that the banks are getting their raw material practically free, hardly any cost. And they're then allowed to engage in a huge markup to sell, to bundle up that cash and sell it back to the people. Along the way, make hefty bank charges and overdraft charges, and the state bails out the banks. It also provides them with all kind of ways of flattering their balance sheet. We might call it quantitative easing, so far £745 billion. It provides legitimacy for the sector, for example, through the deposit-taking license. Who would want to put their money in a bank which did not have a deposit-taking license? Not many would want to do that. It provides confidence by saying to people, look, up to £85,000 of your deposits are secure if something was to go wrong. And the state has been bolstering the consumer base of banks. For example, all social security payments are now made through the banking system and not through the post office. So what that means is that the state has important leverage, and we as people have to ensure that the state exercises that leverage on our behalf. Okay, and that of course is an issue, how we actually mobilize the state. But the state is a key actor, and all the state agencies, including regulators. So that is in a sense the kind of a business model, if you like, of the banks. But the banks have been notoriously irresponsible. The whole, indeed, the City of London has been notoriously irresponsible. If I may read out a quote from the 1997 UK government investigation into share price rigging at Guinness, and the inspectors said, and I quote, that at major corporations there is a cynical disregard of laws and regulations, cavalier misuse of company monies, contempt for truth and common honesty. All these in a part of City of London which was thought to be respectable. I don't think anything has really changed since 1997, and the daily charge sheet appears in almost every newspaper, and it is still allowed to continue. So the banks have actually been serial offenders. It is hard to think of any other industry which has committed offences at the same scale and at the same rate. And then we ended up with the 2007 and 8 crash. If anything, the government regulations, or the lack of it, encouraged banks to behave badly. For example, the Financial Services Act 1986 issued a deregulation, and when the bill was going through the committee stages in Parliament, somebody reminded Thatcher, hey, gambling debts are not really enforceable in law. Do you know that these banks are going to gamble massively, whether it's through derivatives or anything else? And the government rather hastily introduced amendments at that stage, and the banks gambled heavily. And that came home to roost in the 2007 and 8 crash, which was not caused by people rushing to withdraw their money from banks. It was caused because the banks had taken reckless risks. At Bear Stearns, almost 100% of the profits were coming from speculation, and they didn't really lend any money to anybody for 5 years. At Lehman Brothers, about 80% of their profits came from speculation. Now you can win some of the financial horses, but all your horses aren't going to win all the time. And that and the government's recent ring fencing does not really deal with the problems. It just goes through a cosmetic adjustment really to that. And we can see banks all the time when you look at things about money laundering, tax avoidance, they're really at the forefront of it. So in a sense, banks are not going to behave if they're left to self-regulation. You can't really take them at their words that they would somehow be honorable. Those conditions have to be imposed, monitored, enforced. And I will come to some possible suggestions. One reason for banking scandals and problems is the failure of corporate governance. Now, I'm not aware of anybody in the market saying to banks, by the way, don't go for more profits, don't take more risks. Indeed, at the 2007-8 crash, after that, I gave some evidence to parliamentary committees, and the people I knew at banks or some of the investors, they were actually pushing banks to be even more reckless because they wanted higher returns and higher dividends. And shareholders generally have a very, very short-term interest. So typical in the days of automated share dealings, you have a bundle of shares traded every 20 seconds. People just aren't really there long enough to take interest. Those who are really vitally affected are workers and consumers. Workers and consumers need to be on bank boards. They need to have seats on bank boards so that they can disrupt this kind of a single-minded worldview that somehow we got to enrich shareholders come what may. Workers and consumers also, they can be identified with certainty. They need to vote on executive pay. If directors are ripping off people, whether because they are mortgage prisoners or anything else, well, there's a good chance that those consumers will not be voting for mega executive pay. And there were indeed those kind of proposals mooted in the last Labour manifesto, though the media did not really amplify those kind of proposals. The banks are generally escaping regulation at the moment, and it is called shadow banking, which is completely beyond regulation, which is a disaster waiting to happen, because shadow banking at the moment is bigger than retail banking, and that is not really being looked at. And where exactly those shadow banks get their resources from? Retail banks, pension schemes, insurance companies, wealthy individuals. So they are dovetailed into the system when that collapses, and that will happen. So there's a mega history. You go back to the 1970s, there was a secondary banking crash. What did it show? Lots of frauds committed, auditors asleep, accounts being massaged, cooked, and roasted. Nothing really has changed. That really continues in exactly the same way. I won't go through lots of episodes, but one I will just refer to. BCCI, Bank of Credit Commerce International, was the biggest banking fraud of 20th century. It was closed in July 1991. To this day, there's not been any independent investigation of the closure of that bank. Governments, regulators have hushed it up. And that means our regulatory system is devoted to protecting wrongdoers. It does not really protect customers. And reason for that is that there is always this consideration. Somebody's too big to regulate. What is bad for the industry? We need to make welfare of consumers, people, the main priority. That should be the only priority of the regulators. We have responsibility failures. So directors are very rarely personally prosecuted in the UK. Fines have just become another cost of doing the business. That is not really enough. We need to prosecute the people. So after the banking crash, Vietnam prosecuted 46 bankers after the last banking crash. Iceland, 36 bankers. Ireland, 4 banks. Ireland is pretty small economy. US, 324, out of which 222 went to prison. UK just prosecuted 5 convictions, secured 5 convictions. That is all it secured. And many of those not really effective. In Australia, there was a Royal Commission. We didn't have any. We had some parliamentary hearings, but they were not given all the evidence that they needed. And of course, when people come to parliamentary committees, they are pretty well coached by PR and other people on what to say, what not to say. Already been referred to regulatory issues. We have 41 regulators dealing with the finance industry, 41. Okay, of which 25 deal with money laundering. Out of those 25, 22 are beyond the freedom of information scope altogether. It is a crazy system of overlapping, duplicating regulators accountable to absolutely no one. everyone would be familiar with the RBS, with the RBS frauds and also the HBOS frauds. And of course, it's been reported how banks have been forging people's signatures as well. We've not seen any regulator really take serious action until they've been pushed. And even then, they've been dragging their feet. And indeed, in the Labour manifesto, there was a proposal that we should really have an independent public inquiry into the entire finance industry. That way, the victims, many of who may well be present in this virtual room, can also question their tormentors and put forward their own evidence. And I think that should still be highly relevant. So we have a regulatory failure. I think I'm just about, if you just give me a couple more minutes, am I okay, Andy? Yeah, okay. We also have political failure. And I already referred to political failure, for example, about BCCI, but that's not the only one. So HSBC got fined $1.9 billion in the US for money laundering failures. It was US regulators wanted to launch a criminal prosecution without telling any parliamentary committee or anybody else. The then Chancellor George Osborne secretly wrote to the US regulators asking them to go easy. It's too big to prosecute. There would be very nasty consequences. That is a wrong approach. That does not really encourage banks to be responsible. If they've done something, they really need to be prosecuted, need to be dealt with. Again, when we look on the prosecuting side, we have very, very tiny prosecuting units. The SFO is not, does not really have a wonderful record. Crown Prosecution Service hardly touches banks. The Ministry of Justice is nowhere to be seen. So we really need lots and lots of regulatory reform, about which Andy's already booked me to talk about at another time. Accounting numbers are utterly unhelpful. I was one of the advisors to the Work and Pensions Committee for investigating BHS and Carillion. The kind of accounting which these companies do is not suitable for banks whatsoever. The kind of accounting reports which are prepared tell capital markets how rich shareholders have become. That is not the basis to look at whether banks are serving society, whether banks are viable. They are utterly inappropriate. And I said that to a parliamentary committee, the Banking Standards Commission, and they agreed, and they recommended that alternative measures and reports be developed. Nothing whatsoever has happened at that front, okay? And those measures need to apply to anybody selling financial products. And the last point I want to make is anybody selling financial products should be required to test them first. Consider when they come back to bite consumers. Nobody can sell medicine without it is being tested. Nobody can sell food without it is being tested. Why on earth we are allowing banks to sell myriad financial products without being tested? Thank you. And I'm sure I'll come back later on more for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Prem. That was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And Prem mentioned he's going to be speaking again on the 15th of December. We've got a rather brave event. We're nothing if not brave. The event's title is, Are the UK's Financial Regulators Failing? I'll repeat the title, Are the UK's Financial Regulators Failing? 6 p.m. UK times, 8 p.m. UK time, December the 15th. We think that by then, there'll be perhaps a couple of independent reports out on the effectiveness of the FCA in relation to consumer protection issues. Interesting title, Are the UK's Financial Regulators Failing? And as I say, Prem is one of our speakers. I'm going to quickly pick up on the last point Prem made about the wisdom of financial products being properly tested before they're laid out in the market. Some of you might know that Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was a presidential candidate, of which I'm a huge fan, by the way. I think she's fantastic. I'll find the link and I'll put it into the chat. There's a wonderful YouTube video of her talking about how she nearly burnt her house down And the reason she nearly burnt her house down is because many years ago, she had a toaster that was faulty. There she was making some toast. The bleeding thing caught fire. It nearly burnt her house down. Net result, there was loads of legislation passed that basically said, before you're allowed to sell a toaster, you have to make sure that the thing won't catch fire. Rather obvious, don't you think? And she rather brilliantly in her talk goes on to say, why on earth do we allow financial services products into the market that are simply not safe? Yeah, not safe. And last week, I think it was, we had an event all about the whole issue of making sure that products going into the market have to be safe before they're allowed to enter the market. If it's good enough for toasters, surely it's got to be good enough for people's life savings, for goodness sake. Prem, thank you very much.
Andy,
We've got time for 2 or 3 questions. So
yeah, Andy,
I'm going to invite you, bear with me folks, I'm going to invite you just to raise your hand if you would like to say something. I've dropped my glasses, so I need to pick them up. I'll be back. Thank you. Please do fire away. Thank you. So was that Prem that wanted to say something else? No, I think we've got Greg and we've got Ed, I think. Greg, please do. Greg Solomon, please very briefly introduce yourself.
Very brief comment, but just following on from what Prem was saying, I was actually working as a contractor at HSBC when that problem was, well, had completely hit the fan. And I just wanted to tack on that it's a couple of things. One, that whilst it was a very large bill in terms of trillions, it actually came with extra teeth. And the extra teeth were, well, certainly included that they had a very, very large contingent of people appointed by the US Fed to be adopted into the company to have internal sight of all manner of things with a very, very high priority in terms of their service level above the overall HSBC chief exec. And that was an element of teeth that the US regulators have that the UK regulators have never shown, and the US can bite harder. Even though it was a very, very large fine, it was not. It was a deferred prosecution. So as long as within a five-year period, everybody abided by the inspector's diligence and complied very closely and opened up, then there was going to be no prosecution. So that is something that our authorities don't have the ability to do, and clearly we have never shown the teeth in this country.
Greg, thank you very much indeed for your very, very good point. I think we had Ed Tuhig from Canada with us. Ed, where are you? There you are. Ed, please, as succinctly as you can, make your point for me. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I was just going to make the point from my experience as a trustee in bankruptcy. When it became to a few of us, we looked at the way that the debts of their customers were all ranked, and all banks and all credit cards were ranked equally. We contended that those credit cards and bank loans that were issued after the first one were the ones that caused the bankruptcy, and therefore should be ranked in order of their issue. And but of course, the banking conspiracy, the lobbyists, would have nothing to do with changing anything that would change the power of the banks at all. So we still have the rule that they all rank equally, although the ones that share in the assets left over equally with others are the ones that actually caused bankruptcy. I don't know whether that occurs in other countries or not, but it was something we tried to correct at that time and just made no headway at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And for those of you that don't know, Ed has a successful political career from Canada. Great that you're with us, Ed. The person that's with us from the furthest place away has got to be Mr. Michael Gearin. Michael, could you just very briefly introduce yourself and tell everybody where you are? Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks to Robert for that very moving comment on Paul Moore. Look, I'm in Sydney, Australia. I've had the experience of attending some of our royal commissions here in this country, and I think have been appalled by the lack of action and the subsequent issues that have arisen in banks such as Westpac and an Austrac fine of over $1 billion just recently. So it is a never-ending question. And when I go around speaking to institutional shareholders, they look at me sympathetically and say, Michael, you will never change it. And that's why I'm part of Transparency Task Force, because I simply do want to change it.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael, for being with us especially given the time it is where you are. We're now going to go straight on to Greg Leroy. Greg will obviously introduce himself and tell you about Violation Tracker. Just before he starts speaking, let me tell you this, folks. I am absolutely convinced that Violation Tracker is part of the solution. It is a wonderful utility that people in the US are making extremely good use of, as you'll hear. The UK needs Violation Tracker. If we're going to have any hope at all of actually making the banking sector and frankly the entire world of commerce work as we need it to serve society rather than to frankly exploit society, then we need to be able to keep a track of which organizations are misbehaving. So to elaborate on that, so we're now going to go to Greg Leroy, a gentleman who I've come to respect and admire greatly, but even more importantly, what he and his colleagues have developed is so good, we have to somehow find a way of getting it into the UK. Greg, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andy. And I just put as an attachment in the chat box a 2-pager background on this effort we're making to replicate Violation Tracker in the UK. And I want to really tip my hat to Andy for being the Energizer bunny, grabbing me by the lapels 6 or 7 months ago and never letting go on this effort. And I know a few of you are aware of our efforts, and I'm glad to meet the rest of you. And I'm have to talk to Andy about having to follow Professor Sika. That's a tough act to do. I'm pleased to meet you, Professor, and really great to hear your talk. Your reputation precedes you. So I'm going to screen share quickly and show you our database called Violation Tracker. If you go to the front page of our website, goodjobsfirst.org, and click on the right end of the top bar there to Violation Tracker, it's one of 4 databases we have. This is the regulatory database. It's 5 years old this month, and it basically is a giant compilation of about 50 national or federal regulatory agencies' records for the last 20 years, and about 200 state regulatory agencies, as well as every office of the Department of Justice, every Attorney General, every state insurance and banking commissioner, all together 20 years. And then once we gather the data in its raw form, we also marry or associate subsidiaries with their corporate parents. And we update the database 4 times a year, including updating the relationships between parents and subsidiaries based on mergers and acquisitions. So, and you can see here a log of sources that we use. You can click on that and see the many agencies that we collect here, not just financial, but also consumer, workplace, energy, bribery, foreign corrupt practices, amazing, all kinds of antitrust, monopoly, before you get to the state sources as well. And then the reason this jumped to Andy's attention, if you look at the industry totals here, just compare how many records we have from various sectors of the economy, well, banks stand out very negatively. You'll notice that they're not only number 1, but by a factor of about 7.5 to 1, they are the most penalized sector of any in the United States, far more than oil and gas or big pharma or the big 3 automakers or anybody else. $325 billion worth of penalties in the last 20 years. Almost 6,000 citations.
You'd never believe it, would you?
Yeah. And if you click on this, you can actually see all the entries. So you can get the big 10 in terms of the number of companies that have been most penalized. And if you click on these individual things, you'll see all the entries we have for those individual banks. And obviously we have some UK entities here and other foreign entities, Deutsche Bank, of course. And you can see the number of records here. And then in rank order of size of penalties, we have them all listed here in descending order of size. And if you click on any individual case, pick a Royal Bank of Scotland case here, you'll see the original record. So this was a toxic securities fine worth $5.5 billion. It was from one of our home loan finance associations, and we always take you back to the original record. In this case, it's a press release issued by the agency announcing the settlement of the case against Royal Bank of Scotland. So I think the reason that we, and we're very keen on this, we have a large number of, I should add, this is an insanely popular database. It has a massive global user base. It's providing now about 2 million page views per month and rising. We also have more than 150 academics in 14 countries that have been given complete sets of the data pursuant to non-commercial use agreements. And we have 7 ESG or impact investing investment advisory houses purchasing the data from us, licensing it with quarterly updates. But I think the reason that Andy is so keen on it and why we've been so glad to meet so many of his colleagues in the UK is that you have all the same issues here, but you don't have any good way of documenting recidivism. That is, which banks are committing the same kinds of offenses over and over again. And obviously that's critical to building an important argument around all the safeguards that Professor Sika and so many other people have articulated all these years about the need to make penalties more meaningful, to hold company executives personally accountable, to build the case for restructuring banks to make them more responsible. And I'll leave that as the opening primer and take any questions unless Andy has something else he wants me to demonstrate.
No, that's been absolutely perfect. Thank you very, very much indeed. As everybody knows, the Transparency Task Force is about making a difference, and we can only make a difference if we do stuff. Talking alone actually doesn't achieve anything. So we want people to work together. We're quite good at enabling people to find ways to work as a team. And right now we've got a team of volunteers of, I think, about 12, 13 people. They include, for example, the people who run the all-party parliamentary group on fairer business banking in the UK. They include, for example, people such as Jacina Cameling, who is the head of regulatory outreach for the CFA Society for the whole of Europe. We've got some great people in the group, but we want more people in the group. And what we're going to basically do is work out which organisations are aligned with us in wanting to bring Violation Tracker to the UK market. Essentially, it's an X-ray machine. Violation Tracker is an X-ray machine. It X-rays the entire world of commerce, and it lets us know where the dark shadows are, if you get my drift. And when we know where the dark shadows are, we can do more about it. We can shine a big bright light on those dark shadows, and we can take remedial action. It is ridiculous that organizations are able to simply pay their way out of trouble, because all that's happening is the shareholders of those organizations are in effect paying the fines. The individual human beings that lead and run the organizations are not being investigated, are not being prosecuted, etc., etc., etc. This is what needs to change. There is a lot of activity in the regulatory framework within the UK right now, and there are many individuals and many organizations scratching their heads wondering why the regulatory framework is as ineffective as it appears to be. One of the reasons is because it's possible for organizations to do bad, get caught doing bad, get prosecuted and fined for doing bad, but no individual is sufficiently accountable. And you might say, well, yeah, but we've got the senior managers certification regime. That's all changed. As many of the people in this session will know, how many times has the senior manager certification regime actually been used? So these are big questions. So thank you very much indeed, Greg, for spending some time with us this evening from over in Washington, DC. We do have time for some questions and comments. Please, please, please don't just listen to this stuff. Become involved. That's why you're here. Mr. Nicholas Ashford from MIT. Then we'll go to Sue Lewis. Nicholas, please very, very briefly introduce yourself. Get as succinctly as you can, sir. Please tell us what your point is.
to have settlements, and it's always settlements for pennies on the dollar. Or in the UK, if the same practice is followed, it would be pennies on the pound. So these are slaps on the wrist. It isn't. They're not prosecuted. The violations are not prosecuted. I would imagine you have the same problem.
We do. We absolutely do. That's why we've got to find a way to sing together, sing loud, sing clear, sing with the right words in the right way, and get the message across. We're going to go to Sue Lewis, then we're going to Professor Prem Seeker. Sue, over to you. Please unmute. Thank you.
Great. Hi, Sue Lewis, independent consultant, I suppose. Very quick question, Greg. I mean, it's a brilliant thing, but what impact does it have?
So we're still sussing that out, and a lot of the users we don't even know. We think that we know it's being heavily used by ESG investment advisors, some of whom have told us clearly they think it's a better mousetrap, that it has better predictive value than a lot of the glossy things that pass for ESG screening criteria these days. We also know it's being used a lot by investigative journalists and by people seeking to hold companies accountable, whether it's on a labor organizing campaign or an environmental accountability campaign. But I honestly, I think we're a very small organization. This is one of 4 databases we maintain. If I could raise some money to do some more impact assessment, it would be high on my list, frankly. We certainly are getting some feedback now from some of the academics who have used it, and a couple of papers that have been generated in the United States, even getting into the issue of inequality and regulatory behavior, are coming up with some very powerful findings, but it's early in that process for them.
But we must hope that as institutional investors focus more on ESG factors, they'll start to look at this type of issue. I mean, that's got to be the future, surely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your point and your response. We're now going to go to Professor Prem Seeker, who's going to be the final person making a comment before we have a short comfort break, folks. Prem, thank you again for your session earlier. It really was superb. Your point, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Just a brief comment. First, thank you, Greg, for a wonderful resource. Is it available free to the public?
Oh, yes, I should have mentioned, absolutely free. You don't have to register. You can't download the whole database for free at one time, but you can do large chunks at one time. Yes, absolutely free and open.
Yeah. And
okay, the second point I just want to quickly make is about the fines. David's already put up a comment about the destination of the fines, but interestingly, if you look at the world of accounting, if there was an audit failure in the UK before 2016, and some of those investigations are still going on. Recently, Deloitte got fined £15 million for a pre-2016 audit failure. Those fines go to the body which licensed the incompetent auditor. So there is a windfall for the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. They keep the fine. So amazing. You can encourage your members to be incompetent and you get rich. And therefore the members' subscription is not increased, their license fees are not increased, and they have a large sum with which to conduct PR campaigns and lobby Parliament. That is a paradox of the so-called regulatory system.
Prem, thank you very much indeed. Prem, with your permission, I'd welcome the chance to actually fix up a conversation between yourself, myself and Greg, because we're at the early stages of having some very interesting conversations with folks in the UK about Violation Tracker, and we'd be grateful for your tips in terms of strategy, etc. If you're happy to do that, we'll organise it, Prem. Thank you very, very much indeed. All right, we're going to applaud Greg, and I'm not sure if we did it earlier for Prem or not. So for both Greg and Prem, let's wave our hands, behave like you're 6. This is what we do. Everyone get involved. We behave like we're 6. It's just coming up to 25 minutes past the hour. We've got a 5-minute comfort break. Do whatever you like. Whilst we've got that break, I'm going to play that song from Willie Porter called How to Rob a Bank. The lyrics are all about what we are discussing this evening. So please be ready to reconvene at 30 minutes past the hour. Thank you very much indeed, folks. I've really enjoyed your company so far. And I want to once again in particular thank Robert Delner for his very meaningful comments earlier. That's all I want to say about that. Robert, thank you very much indeed, sir. Thank you. Okay.
Let's do a song about guilt-free living. Some say I need a driver, Dixon mask and gun. Let me tell you, brothers and sisters, it's not how you get a bank job done. You can't walk in there brazen with a newsie like Patty Hearst. I get some decent suits and a bogus business plan. Become well versed in the etiquette of Wall Street Disneyland. I hit the country clubs, eating peanuts and drinking scotch. I'll talk the recent trends and fart into a velvet couch. Oh, that's how you rob a bank. Can you do that? Yeah, that's how you rob a bank. Get a foundation to give me thanks and give my congressman a wank. Apologize for all I drank when I pulled those goldfish from the tank. Gave those debutantes a spank. Oh, that's how you rob a bank. Then I'll cry to Congress that I just can't survive after giving loans to folks for homes they can't afford to buy, and building useless cars that nobody wants to drive. Then I'll threaten massive layoffs just like blackmail in disguise. Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's how you rob the bank. Yeah, that's how you rob. My family won't judge me, they'll accept the gifts I send. Even though it's not my money, that doesn't mean I should not spend. As the dough piles up like snow in Switzerland, I'll smile when the feds can't take me in. And with an army of lawyers, I'll soon outflank and spin the tail behind my ship sank. Get my bonus and give my thanks and spend 6 measly months in Shawshank. You know what's coming. Oh, that's how you rob a bank. Can you sing that? Oh, that's how you rob a bank. Sing like your rich uncle. That's how you rob a bank. Like your grandma, that's how you rob a bank. You're a little kid. It's a cross-collateralization agreed that brought us all this stuff we really don't need and made it so hard for us to feed people who are just the same as you and me. Can you do that part too? See how easy it is to get hung up on your stuff. I said truth and landing is a two-way street, and Wall Street put the fire to my feet, and the SEC never took a pig. Blame it all on unchecked greed and a tumble war. Yeah, I blame it all on unchecked greed. She's a tireless whore. Yeah, that's how you rob. Oh, that's how you rob. That's how you rob. Some say I need a driver, a Nixon mask and gun. But obviously, brothers and sisters, it's not how you get a bank job.
Okay, folks, that was Willie Porter's How to Rob a Bank. I stumbled across that.
My name's Willie Porter.
Oh, forgive me, I need to turn him off
I'm
now.
happy to be back.
Oh, there we go. That was Willie Porter's How to Rob a Bank. I stumbled across that after listening to Woody Guthrie's song, which is a lot older, same basic message. And Woody Guthrie's song is called The Jolly Banker. I'll find that and circulate that afterwards as well. Okay, we're going to move on. We're going to go straight to our Just a Minute round. The idea of our Just a Minute round is that it's inspired by the Radio 4 program called Just a Minute, where speakers have a chance to, within a minute, talk about what they want to speak about. I'm going to read out the order of our Just a Minute speakers. The order is as follows: Mr. Philip Meadowcroft, Ed Tuhig, Nicholas Ashford, Steve Hubbard, and we'll then have a few minutes after that to open up for general debate and discussion. That will take us through to 8 o'clock. We'll then formally close the session, but we will keep the channel open so that we can all have what we call our fireside chat bit, completely unstructured, very lightly facilitated, a chance for everybody to get what they want to get off their chest. Remember the key actions. Make it clear in the chat if you want to be part of the Bring Violation Tracker to the UK project. Make it clear to me in the chat if you want to be part of the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services. Make it very clear to me if you want to volunteer to do anything. We want everyone to volunteer to do something. If everybody does a little bit, then we can make even more progress than the progress I think we are making. So that's great stuff, everybody that's been able to speak so far. Thank you also for the input through the questions. We're now going to go straight to Mr. Philip Meadowcroft, who I think many of you will know. He will very briefly introduce himself and then share with us his thoughts for up to 60 seconds. And you're on the clock, Mr. Meadowcroft. Where are you? Can you please wave? There you are, I can see you. Please unmute, Philip, and over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. I'm chairman and investment trustee of our family company's pension scheme. I've closely followed the conduct of banks and other institutions and their regulators for the past 15 years, with particular reference to the bank's handling of personal and commercial customers and the reactions of the regulators and the Treasury. Fixing banking in the UK is going to have to be a draconian set of measures implemented with a sort of robustness, even ruthlessness, which has been delicately avoided so far. The violation tracker has exposed those US banks which have faced humongous penalties, with Bank of America, as we've seen, leading the way. But I understand that there are some US bankers behind bars, but no British bankers in the retail or SME sector are resident in Ford Open Prison right now, as far as I know. And I wonder whether the US regulatory system is in some ways better equipped to regulate misconduct. I want to illustrate that by quoting to you from today's Private Eye. Deference is a key pillar of city enforcement. Unless the punishment fits the crime, why should those who break the rules, never mind the con artists and the dishonest directors, be deterred by the regulations? Back in 2018, the FCA fined the Barclays CEO over £642,000 for trying to uncover a whistleblower at the bank. The New York State Department of Financial Services then fined Barclays $15 million for the way it handled the episode. Says Private Eye, guess which penalty might encourage no repeats? It's over 4 years since the Treasury Select Committee, then chaired by Andrew Tyree, instructed the FCA, then their CEO, then Andrew Bailey, to investigate the culpability of HBOS directors at the time of the bank's collapse. The FCA has not reported, nor is it required to give any update for fear of its independence being undermined. If the FCA wants to go to sleep at the wheel, it simply can. Why on earth are investigations into alleged banking misconduct commenced without a timeline after which the regulator has come to Whitehall or Westminster for compelling reasons why extra time is needed? We need a case management approach like we see in our law courts. Without it, cases can be dragged into the long and deep grass and slowly disintegrate. And then we need to prevent bankers, no doubt using shareholders' funds, running to their learned, bewigged friends with draft reports on alleged misconduct and with urgent requests for those conclusions to be rewritten. In other words, an end to maximalization, such a quaint term, immortalizing one of the greatest fraudsters of our time. Thank you, Andy. A bit over a minute, I'm sorry.
You were, but you were well worth it. No problems at all. Philip Meadowcroft, thank you very much indeed. We're now going to go straight to Ed Tuhig in Canada. Ed, please share with us your further thoughts, and I'm sure it's going to be as passionate as the last point you made. Go for it. Thank you, Ed.
I want to talk about the commons, the concept of sovereign currency. Sovereign currency is, the concept is that the money is created as a commons of the people, in which case it's equal to each person that is part of the commons. However, when that currency gets into circulation, it is used unequally among all those members of the commons. Some will use very little of it, some a great deal. And the point is that the people on whose behalf we issue the currency does not receive a return for the use of their currency. So the man who has $1 million in use should probably be paying a fair interest rate to the rest of the people in the commons who may or may not be using a similar amount or none at all. So as a basic concept, I don't think I've ever heard it debated to any extent, but it has been bothering me for some time because it is the commons that has been polluted or misused by so many, a small portion of our economies and a small portion of our societies. And we should be charging the banks who use this money that total amount, and let's say a 3% basic savings account figure, in which case that no risk money would be receiving payment for all the members of the commons. Anyway, just a concept that it's a kind of out in the ether somewhere, but I've thought of it lately. Thank you very much.
Ed, thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us, Ed. That's wonderful. We'll go now straight to Mr. Nicholas Ashford, who again is going to very briefly introduce himself and make his point as close to 1 minute as you can. Make it, please, Nicholas. Thank you very much, sir.
I teach sustainable development at MIT. I've already chimed in that I thought that having the regulatory agencies go after settlements rather than prosecuting violations was a major problem. And part of the problem is they just don't have the staff. And we need to up the staff in those agencies. Secondly, we're about having an election here, and the issue of whether the Democrats win is very relevant to the future of the U.S. Consumer Finance Protection Agency, which could do a lot, and you ought to make common purpose with them. The third point is that the elite control the political agenda, and the elite are the ones with enormous amounts of money and nexus to the financial movement in the country. And until you attack that problem, you're going to have a problem. Finally, we have to recognize the privilege that the banks have through the reserve requirements. They can loan historically 6 times as much money as they actually have. And my brother, who teaches corporate law at Syracuse Law School, reminds me that very few people ever got rich by working. They got rich by owning. And yet owning is not something individuals, workers, or citizens can do unless they put their spare cash into buying stocks or bonds. But they ought to be allowed to borrow through a principle called binary economics, just like the banks can borrow. It's the borrowing and the leveraging of assets that gives way to so much power.
Wow, thank you very much indeed, Nicholas. Powerfully delivered points there. You mentioned the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We know them well. Barbara Roper, who's the executive in charge of the financial services bit, spoke at one of our events the other day. I'll just very quickly share with you all a particular page on our website, just in case you're unaware, if I can get to it quickly enough. The page I want to show you is basically about our international outreach. I think some of you will know, because I will have met you, that last year I It was a very tough year last year, but I managed to run meetings in London, of course, many meetings in London, but I also managed to run meetings in Dublin, Amsterdam, Zurich, Brussels, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney, Melbourne, Washington, DC, New York, and Boston. And the net result is that the Transparency Task Force is truly becoming an international force for good. So we have regular Zoom meetings with people in Hong Kong, the Netherlands, the USA, Singapore, Belgium, Luxembourg, Australia, Switzerland, India, Ireland, Canada, France, South Africa. We are becoming what we want to become, and what we want to become is a highly respected international institution that is dedicated to looking after the consumer's financial interests. That's why we exist. That's why we're making the sacrifices we're making to do what we are trying to do. We're going to go to our next and final 1 minute round speaker, Mr. Stephen Hubbard, who's going to be as succinct and as punchy as he possibly can be. Stephen, please introduce yourself and go for it. Thank you very much indeed, sir. Thank you. You'll need to unmute first, Steve. This happens every time. Well, go on, Steve.
Okay, am I okay now?
Yes, you are, sir.
Yeah, my background is engineering and science, really, rather than financial management. So therefore, I'm slightly an outsider of this, the main thrust of perhaps today's meeting. However, I've just sat here increasingly emotionally charged and involved. This is one of the best meetings I've been to, Andy. The amount of emotion coming forward from the people about the problems within the system is breathtaking to me. I mean, I come with it from a sort of a natural science versus nature versus humanity approach, and therefore I thought, well, nature and macroeconomics, how does it actually work, and so on. And I've in the past with colleagues have had a rather of probably unemotional approach to these things, and I'm just stunned by the degree, starting with Paul Moore, and a very good mention of him. Obviously I read about him in the news, but it's great to hear more. And the emotion and the degree of vituperativeness really amongst people has just got greater and greater. You know, it's quite clear that across the whole board, the situation is rather desperate. And I mean, it seems to me it's a systematic problem from what I've heard, rather than just the traditional bad apple option. You know, you always get a cross section of people, you always get bad apples, you always get somebody who does something wrong takes advantage. But that's not been the case that I've heard so far. It's been a systematic problem. And so, and the role of the law seems to be, you know, there seems to be a sense almost of being above the law, which again is quite shocking. So it's been a really very good eye-opener for me, and I'm really grateful to have been involved. Thanks, Andy.
Steve, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to speak to a point that you just made, and then we'll go to Q&A and open discussion in just a minute, okay? But Brian Basham was going to be speaking this evening. It looks like he's had a problem. I think he might be on a train somewhere. But I'm going to try to articulate something that Brian taught me a few months ago, and it's really registered with me, okay? And when I say this, I promise you, I'm saying this not from a political perspective. All right, I'm not a politically orientated person, okay? I have my beliefs and I have my values, as we all do, but believe me, I'm not particularly wedded to any particular political party. I'm not. But let me tell you this. Brian Basham and I, he's a man I really admire, by the way. Brian Basham and I had a conversation, I think it was about 4 months ago, and I was trying to kind of find out from Brian what the fundamental systemic problem is. And he said something to me, and he said it, he explained it in about 20 seconds, but as soon as he said it, I got it. And what he basically said is this: within the UK, and in fact within many Western developed nations, we do not have true democracy. What we actually have is a perversion of democracy. And what I mean by that is this, and what I'm about to say is very well evidenced. You'll find all sorts of people who provide evidence for what I'm about to say. Basically, To become the political party in charge takes a hell of a lot of support, often in the form of money. So when political parties become the government, and I could be talking about the UK here, I could be talking about the USA, I could be talking about pretty much any country, the government ends up owing favours to one end of this political spectrum or another. It could be the unions at one end, it could be the banks at the other. And all the time we end up with governments that are in some way indebted to the people that effectively paid to get them there. We have a democracy that is distorted. Demos, the democracy, is essentially meant to be about the people being in charge. Yeah, but what we end up with is a government that is in effect loyal to those that helped put it in power. And in the UK, that means the banks have an enormous influence over the way the system works. And when Brian explained this to me, I kind of suddenly saw things so much more clearly. I suddenly saw why, frankly, bluntly, I might as well go for it anyway, the regulators don't do their job properly. Plain English, we have regulatory capture of an extreme nature that is so well camouflaged by lobby groups and campaign organizations that it really is difficult to see it. But how else can we explain the mess we're in? How else can we explain, ladies and gentlemen, that the one industry in the world that ought to be the most trusted of them all, think about it, the financial services sector has to be trusted to function. That's why we've got on our notes, you know, we promise to pay the bearer the sum of. The word promise is essentially part of that contract with the people, that it's legit, that it's real. Yeah, the Latin word credere is where we get the word credit from. The entire financial system has to be trusted to function successfully. And this is why on the 6th of May 2015, when I gave a speech at Senate House, London University, I pointed out the facts. The facts are the industry that ought to be the most trusted is the least trusted. This harks all the way back to some of the slides that John Martin, our sponsor for this evening, was showing us earlier this evening. So we've got some fundamental issues. One of them is what many people would call regulatory capture. That's why we have to shine a big bright light on the functionality or otherwise of the regulators. That's why we've got a brave event on the 15th of December called Are the UK's Financial Regulators Failing? That's why we recently launched a new TTF group called Regulators Watch. And guess what we're going to do? We're going to watch the regulators. We'll always be constructive, collegiate and civilized in our feedback. But if the regulators are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, then all of us, whether you're part of TTF or otherwise, need to be doing what you can and should be doing to raise awareness of these issues. So thank you very much indeed, Steve, because your reference to systemic failure has hit it on the head. Thank you very much. We're going to open it up to questions and comments now. So I'm going to go to gallery view. Please do raise your hand. I can see Mr. Paul Carlier. Paul, I'm so pleased and proud that you are with us, Paul. Please introduce yourself. Tell everybody a little bit about your background, and then please make your point, Paul. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'd like to echo some of the sentiments that have gone on the chat here, that it's been an excellent forum tonight, and fingers crossed will lead to some meaningful change. I first of all like to echo Robert was saying earlier about Paul Moore and what he suffered at the hands of Lloyds and the FCA. I've had 30 years working on the trading floor of the world's largest banks, and 2-time whistleblower, and 2 times, let's just say, it didn't end well. And you know, and unfortunately, it was as much due to regulatory failure and the FCA covering the tracks of Lloyds as it was Lloyds themselves, and herein lies the problem. And unfortunately, you know, I'm logging on here this evening, and this week we've had the City of London Police actually lie to us about, in terms of giving a reason why they will not investigate perjury or perverting the course of justice, despite overwhelming evidence to prove it. They've come up with a reason that actually contradicts a freedom of information response we got from the Metropolitan Police a year ago asking the same question. And they quote the Lord Chief Justice. So we've either got the Lord Chief Justice or the Met Police lying, or City of London Police lying. And we're pretty confident we know which it is. And unfortunately, herein lies the problem. Here we are in 2020. I mean, the case in question relates back to historic issues that began in 2009. And here we are, we're still having, you know, we've got this case in front of the SFO now, but I can't tell you how much of a battle it's been to get there. And we do believe that the SFO has no choice but to prosecute, because if they don't, and we publish the evidence that we have, that we can't publish because obviously it would prejudice a criminal proceedings, that too many questions are going to be asked, because the evidence is there in black and white. So, you know, it's prosecute or humiliation for the SFO, and it will lead to what I think will be another round of actually effective scrutiny. I think the Dobbs review, for one, I sat with Dobbs's team for about 3 hours and ran through significant evidence, and I'm confident they are going to produce a damning report against Lloyds, and I think they will be critical of the FCA as well, and equally the independent investigation into the IRHP review, which served up what was a paltry remedy for those that were within the review, and denied 5,000 victims that were excluded from it, to the tune of, I think it's 15 billion we've calculated that the FCA and the Treasury combined to deny. And just a little summary as well, I won't go on for any longer, but last August, James Hurley published an article in the Times where, based on the evidence that I gave him, about basically a year-long investigation I undertook, that proved that the FCA, the Treasury, Andrew Bailey and Sajid Javid had all lied and made multiple false representations as to why a new sophistication criteria was introduced in January 2013 into the IRHP review, which excluded 5,000 customers that had always been regarded as non-sophisticated retail, and excluded them from the review. And James Hurley took my research, took my evidence, and proved that they'd all lied about the reason this sophistication criteria was brought in. And there we are waiting for, okay, this is it, you know, justice will be done. Nothing's happened. Literally nothing has happened. This article, I keep checking regularly to see if the article's still there, because if it's false, then, and that's the reason why it's not been investigated or punished, then the article would have been taken down and everything else. But no, it's still there. Literally nothing has happened. You know, evidence to prove the FCA, the Treasury, Sajid Javid and Andrew Bailey all made false representations as to why that criteria is brought in, and nothing. It's like you can hear a pin drop. Like, is anyone going to take it up? And one of the things I would just like to say is that everyone's critical, you know, about US lawyers and this reputation they have. However, we've worked on cases now that globally, multiple cases that have secured about $4.5 billion in damages for the plaintiffs and class actions and other claims. But we can't, you know, all of our work has been for law firms in North America and in Asia. And I think what happens is these guys are so punchy that it scares the regulators that if they don't act and the lawyers secure settlements and expose what's been going on, it embarrasses the regulators. Whereas in the UK, we don't have it, because if the regulators do nothing, the law firms, no one's securing any judgments. Nobody is able to bring a successful civil case. It's, you know, so an effective litigation industry that's capable of taking on the banks, or in admitting that, you know, they need the expertise, it kind of self-regulates. It forces the regulators to be more proactive, otherwise face embarrassment. And this is where the SFO, we're confident they're going to prosecute this case, because not to, with the evidence we've given them, will be they will not be able to answer questions as to why they didn't. So we do think that, you know, it's, but this is a top-down thing. You know, it's regulators, ombudsman, police. You know, it's got to change.
Paul, thank you so much for your input. That's very, very valuable input indeed. I will stress this. My colleague Alexandra will put her email address into the chat in just a moment. I think she's done it already, but she'll do it again just shortly. If anybody has put anything into the chat in written form or has said anything during the event that you don't want to go out there on social media, because this whole session is being recorded, if for any reason you want that, then just pop my colleague Alexandra an email and we'll organise to make sure it doesn't happen, okay? So that applies to anybody for any reason, no reason to explain, just let Alexandra know what you want to be removed or taken out or edited. We're now going to go to Helen McGregor. I think I've got the right surname, Helen. And then we're going to go to Mr. Andy Aitkenhead. Please be as short and sweet as you can be, so we'll get a few of these quick points in before we formally wrap up at 8 o'clock. But as I said, we will be keeping the channel open for fireside chat after that. Helen, please introduce yourself and share with us what you would like to say. Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, thanks very much, Andy. So I formerly worked at Barclays Capital and HSBC, but also a victim of some investment scams, London Capital and Finance, and another one called Ready to Invest, which I have discussed with you. So I was closely involved in the LCF investigation in terms of serious regulatory failure. As I said, that report's coming out in November. We expect Dame Gloucester to give a scathing review about the way that the FCA regulated LCF. And it's all about the lack of action by these regulatory agencies, how they've been warned by whistleblowers and they've taken no action. And we have exactly the same case in this other investment scam, Ready to Invest, where this guy's sadly passed away, wrote to Martin Wheatley, the then CEO of the FSA, told him about the alleged 100 million fraud, told him from 2010 onwards, and did absolutely nothing. And, you know, consumers suffer at the end of these horrific losses. And I just wanted to mention one thing, because there's not much time, but you may be aware there was a consultation review that came out. There was issued by the FCA in the summer for a 6-week period, and they were trying to limit their liability for regulatory failure to £10,000. And they were saying that they would pay out if they were the primary cause of a loss. Well, essentially, they will never, ever typically be the primary cause of the loss, because it will be the fraudster. So we have issued a couple of consultations. Gina Miller sent one in, and some others, but this is clearly a way to absolve themselves from any accountability or responsibility. And they know they've got these regulatory reviews coming down the line, so they want to just start limiting that potential liability.
Helen, thank you very much indeed. We were also one of the organisations. That was perfect. We were also one of the organisations that contributed to that response, and one of the organisations, as you know, that helped to get the deadline pushed back. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to go straight to Mr. Andy Aitkenhead. Andy, over to you, sir.
A very quick one, really. So, Andy, you talked about action, and you know that one of the things that I like to do is focus on what we're going to achieve. So how do we turn conversation into impact? And I think one of the things to think about, obviously not to make a decision, but to think about now is where we focus in on. You know, there are a number of areas, whether it's a particular type of delinquency that we focus in on. Culture is something that's come up a number of times, but culture is a very complex thing. And in 2 ways, just to illustrate. So one of the things I made a bit of money out of as a consultant nearly 30 years ago was actually advising companies on how to get their banking costs down, because banks systematically lie to the public. And the classic one, it's not the only one, but the classic one then was actually check clearing times. So, you know, obviously it's pretty much an irrelevance these days, but checks do not take 4 days to clear. But but actually you would not get, it was interesting how many corporates were not getting cleared funds until 4 days after checks were paid in. And it's that sort of thing. And in fact, today, I think this thing came out about HSBC not, you know, effectively, systematically not making the effort to try and repatriate dormant funds to people who might have been easily identifiable. So there's an article, I think it's in the Guardian today. So that's actually, you know, a very embedded cultural state in terms of the relationship of the banks with their customers. And then there's the other thing actually, which is around almost a macro issue, which is actually the whole banking system is likely to fundamentally change over the next few years in potentially all sorts of ways. Competition from big tech, you know, the potential for digital currency to disrupt the, you know, the margins of the bank, or even the role of the banks. So, you know, it's worth looking at that. And in fact, I was facilitating an event this morning where that was something that came up, where we were looking at how you change culture of organizations, and investment bank was part of that. I think just one very quick last point, you know, seeing that, you know, that issue about the new financial services bill, it frightens me when I sort of hear more deregulation, because all that has the potential to do is to move supernormal profits into the private sector, with the potential for further increases in public debt down the line. And that is incredibly worrying when you see that sort of thing happening.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. Thank you. It's just gone 8 o'clock, folks, which means that we've kind of come to the formal end. But as I say, we'll keep the channel open till 8:30 for those of you that may want to linger and have a very you know, informal conversation. Of course, I'd very much like to thank all of our speakers. They've been great, and the sense of authenticity and, dare I say it, passion with which people have spoken today has been exceptional. It really has. Thank you in particular, of course, to John for sponsoring our event today. It helps. TTF is seriously broke. We could do with some resource. Regardless of how much resource we've got, we're going to keep battling away because we believe in what we're doing. And the more we do, the more we discover, the more we need to do. So we are as determined as we possibly can be to try to make a difference to everybody. Because that's what we're here for. So thank you all very, very much indeed. If you need to bow out now, just do so. That's wonderful. Before you go, if you want to, put your contact details in the chat if you haven't already done so. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move it onto gallery view, and we're all going to just give us wave a little bit to thank all of us for participating tonight and being part of this. And then we'll allow everybody that wants to bail out to bail out. And if you want to stay, then stay, and we'll carry on the chat, because I think there's a lot more we can say. My very final comment, I want to once again thank Robert Delner, because what he did earlier today was special. He spoke from where it really matters, and that's straight from the heart. Robert, I salute you for sharing your words with us bravely and courageously earlier. And of course, let's all think of Paul Moore and the bravery he showed in becoming a serious, significant whistleblower. I can't begin to imagine how tough that decision must have been, and he stood proud afterwards and took the blows in many ways. I can see Nicholas has got his hand up. Can anybody else that wants to make a point, please raise your hand. We're going to go to Gary Heath. Gary's not had a chance to speak. Then we're going to go to Pauline Creasy. Lovely to see you, Pauline. Mr. Gary Heath, please introduce yourself first and go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. It's Gary Heath, Impartial Financial Advisors Association. Interesting discussion. There are a lot of sort of loose ends. I'll try and stitch one or two of them together. Firstly, you are not going to get the directors of banks sued, not least because most of them have a perfect defence. The government or the regulator told them to do it. That's particularly true of LIBOR, where they attempted to involve those further up the food chain, but they couldn't. Because they would have just said, well, sorry, the government told us to do it, and that there was so much evidence. The only people who have been done on LIBOR are the real village idiots that happen to wander around the city. No one else who of any senior note has been done and won't be. Secondly, you've got a revolving door between the regulator and the banks in huge quantities. Forget about the politicians. Most of them are too incompetent to realise anything's going on. But there is a major event going on between the regulator and the banks, and the regulators aren't going to upset the banks for the very simple reason that they're their next employer. I have a great example of that. At one point, when I set up an organisation that was going to deal with life assurance for people who have difficulty getting life assurance, special risks we call them. Went to the FSA at the time, not the FCA, but the FSA, not there's any difference, and said, do you realise that the banks are stitching people up by basically declaring that they are special risk? Many of them aren't even that. and then charging them 4 or 5 times the cost of life assurance for their loans. As soon as I mentioned the word banks, they weren't interested in having a conversation. Just simply disappeared. Well, finish a coffee and go. So you are against some major players here, and you do have to be aware of that. And the idea that somehow, that we just have to sort of all be nice to each other and suddenly this will be sorted, won't be. Similarly, the American system, which you showed, which is excellent, at the moment, banks refuse, most of the action against banks is seen a decade after the event, because that's when they get fined for something. It takes that long. They're not going to get heavily involved in it. Politicians, where they get involved, I can cite you Equitable Life, where it took in excess of 20 years to get the money out of Equitable Life and to a very small subset of the victims. The reason was that the Treasury had actually encouraged the directors of Equitable Life to trade insolvently over a number of years. And if you do that, that's a 10-year prison sentence. So they had to wait for the civil servants to all retire before that happened. It is a very grubby world, Andy, and much as we would love to have a world that is, going to respond to logic, not always does it do so.
Thank you, Gary. I get your point entirely, sir. I really do. I really do. We're going to go to Pauline Creasy, who I had the pleasure of speaking to for the first time. I think it was just a couple of weeks ago. Pauline, please introduce yourself and share your thoughts. And can I please invite Jean to elaborate on what she put in the chat just now about the Rip-Off Britain, because I haven't seen it, and I'd love to hear from you about it in a minute, Jean, if you're happy to talk to us about it. But first of all, let's go to Pauline. Pauline, please introduce yourself and share your thoughts. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Pauline Creasy. I'm attending, thanks to Andy, as a victim that got caught up in this horrible debacle between banks and the FCA in the UK. I've been in business myself, but I've lost a huge amount of money as a result of the FCA not regulating the smaller firms. The FCA have admitted that they're not regulating them, ostensibly because they're too busy, they say, looking at the larger firms. But the reality is, we've done a lot of work, I and my committee, over the last 2 years, is that they are completely in close relationship with the banks. And it's not just the banks and the FCA, as the previous speaker was saying so well, it's actually also Treasury officials. There's a revolving door between all three. And in fact, I was taken aside quite recently because we put in some papers, as Andy knows, to the Pension Scams Committee, to the Treasury Committee. The police refused to investigate. We've had all sorts of battles. We've had police commissioners on our side saying this should be investigated. 200 people have lost their retirement pots, their life savings. In my case, I was moving from abroad, coming back to the UK, and the money from my house, I was selling it in euros, been changing into sterling, got stolen by this firm who I'd actually used for 12 years. The founder allegedly died. His son, who was working in the business, is actually already a convicted fraudster, which the City of London Police, Douglas, Barrow and Simon Latham, the two top people in the City of London Police, actually said this guy was a fraudster. How did he get to be a director of a financial services firm? Just unbelievable. Fully FCA authorized. They've been reauthorized under stricter, legislation, Payment Services Regulations 2017. And yet 2 months later, they collapsed insolvent, stealing 10.6 million from ordinary workers and ordinary consumers. When we spoke to the Treasury about it, they said, can't interfere with the FCA. As somebody said earlier, they've got to be totally independent. Later on, a very senior Treasury official took me aside and said, you guys have done brilliant work, but you are never going to win, which is what your previous speaker also said. You're just never going to win. The regulator's there to prop up the banks. The banks are too key to the government in charge. It doesn't matter whether it's Conservative or Labour. As somebody else said, we've got to keep them there, and the banks would just pull the rug. You'll never get any law firm to back you because they're all in the pocket of the bankers. And he said, you're wasting your time. He said, the only fraud that will get investigated is big international corruption, where the UK government is under international agreements, commitments to actually do something. You said, we know that we're known as the, Wild West in financial services in Europe and probably globally, but it's not going to change. And he was trying to tell me, I think quite kindly, not to waste any more of my time. But we're absolutely determined. We're not going to give up if it's the last thing we'll do, before we drop dead. And on that, I've had 3 of our victims commit suicide and 5 people have died. Okay, just in the last 2 years, they died because they've got previous ailments, but it was no doubt brought on by the stress of losing their money, their pension money, their retirement pot, whatever. Absolutely horrible business. And I tell you something, nobody cares. The police don't care. And we've been to every government department, possible, and they don't care either. And there was a lady there from LC&F. I don't know whether she's still there, but I have had a conversation with LC&F about this. And, we share a lot of their frustrations. So sorry, that was a bit of a long spiel, but I just thought I'd give it to you from a victim's point of view.
Thank you, Pauline. Oh God, I don't know what to say. There's a phrase we use within TTF. The phrase is parading the problem. We think the media and getting the media on side is a big part of trying to do something. The media can help. It was the media that helped the Australians get the Royal Commission opened. Yes, the Royal Commission hasn't delivered what it could and should have done, but at least they got a massive, great big Royal Commission opened. I say that because I'll come back to you, Pauline, and then I'll go back to Helen. I say that because I think I read something in the chat which has really given me hope, actually. Jean, are you with us still? And Jean, are you able to take yourself off mute and share with us what you put into the chat, please? I just want to double check it says what I think it says. Thanks, Jean.
Hi, yes, and Andy, can you hear me okay?
Perfectly well, thank you.
I'm hiding tonight, so I'm not on screen. Yeah, it was just the Rip Off Britain programme this morning. Just at the end of the programme, there was a lovely moment where it said, it highlighted the MP they've launched the pension scams inquiry. Yeah. So basically they said one of the biggest crimes that we've known, with the awful stories that the programme has covered over a number of years of the pension scams, that this is a real breakthrough moment. Campaigners have hailed it a breakthrough moment. There's a ray of hope on the horizon. So it just showed some of the publicity on the newspapers, Tom's role. So I did spot the TTF and the APPG. As I say, if you can catch it on the catch up, it'll be on there. So it was just at the end of the programme, and hopefully there'll be more that they can elaborate on. So.
Jean, thank you very much. Thank you. That's great to know. If we can get to a point where the journalists can't ignore what's going on, and we get the journalists confident enough. Most of the publications, apart from, for example, the FT and the Times, most of them are very sensitive about what they write about, because the commercial model of a publisher is to rely upon advertising. So it's great when the media is finally coming around to getting this stuff out there. We're going to go to Pauline, because I think she wants to follow up on what she said earlier. Then we're going to go to Helen. Then we're going to go to Philip. Pauline, thank you.
Well, just a quick one about the journalists, about the media, because we did our best to get the media interested, and some of them were. I think the days of investigative journalism really have changed, to a negativity from the perspective of the consumer. A lot of the big media outlets are owned by banks, and we had a very good article actually put out by the Daily Telegraph, where he said he could not mention the banker involved, which was Barclays yet again, who seemed to be doing 70% of the crime in the UK. He said that he couldn't mention them because obviously they were a major shareholder of their newspaper. We had a very good coverage by Sky Crime News, and they did a video clip of us and several of our MPs, and it was a really well put together. The guy even went out to Portugal and Mallorca, where some of the victims were, and did some cameos of the disasters that it brought to some of the victims. And it went out live at 6:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning. It was pulled within an hour. Somebody rang the Sky board, and it was pulled off.
What?
Yeah, that is the power of what goes on. These bankers have got so much power. If they don't want things going out in the media in Britain, it won't go out. And I've had several journalists tell me that they have to be extremely careful about what they say. Otherwise, they'll lose their job. They will get threatened. And until this happened to me, I had no idea. I mean, I don't think I was totally naive, but I didn't realize the scale of it. It is a complete collusion between government, the banks, and the regulator, and it's impossible to break through it. In the UK, I think the Americans have more success because they have more punitive sentences given out. There's more punishment. People are put into orange suits, you know, straight away and intimidated and interviewed. In our case, the fraudsters weren't even interviewed by the police. And we only have to take the word for the SDA that they've interviewed them. They assure us that they have, but we've got no proof, no guarantees. Everything we've asked for under freedom of information, because somebody mentioned that earlier, has been denied. And we're only a small fraud.
Forgive me, Paul. It's even worse than I thought. I've been doing this for 5 years. This is even worse than I thought.
It really is. I mean, I'm not trying to, you know, make our case out to be something, you know, that it isn't. But in the 2 years that we're looking at this, it is absolutely horrific, the scale of the problem. And it will not, it will really take, as somebody said, a very big change for anything to move in the direction of protecting the consumer. Consumers are not protected in the UK. We are just open prey. There is just, you know, there's no other way of putting it.
Pauline, thank you very much. There's a note in the chat from Alex Varley-Winter. The volunteer, I want to stress this, the volunteer journalist who's doing work with and for the TTF. Alex is an absolute hero. My colleague Alexandra will fix up a conversation between yourself, Pauline, and Alex Varley-Winter, because I think what you just said is staggering. We're going to go back to Helen, then we'll go to Mr. Paul Carlier. So, Helen, back to you, I think. Did you want to say something else?
Yeah, well, I was just going to add, so Pauline, have you been in discussion with Joe from the LCF group? Because I think you mentioned you have been talking to some people in LCF.
Yeah, it wasn't actually Joe. I met some of your crowd when they were doing a demonstration outside the SCA.
Oh, with Andrew Bailey, and he had the little candles. Yes.
Absolutely.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And then I was talking to you, the lawyers that are representing you, because they had one of the victims had a relative who's in the Irish, was it an Irish American law firm?
Stearman and Shirley.
Yeah, because we were going to
Shearman and Sterling.
Yeah, we were going to come in with you actually, but then they had to decline because Barclays were a client, and of course Barclays are the banker involved in our fraud. So you know, again, we've had so many instances of that, lawyers not wanting to talk to us.
Yeah, I know, that's right. I mean, I've been talking to Thomas Donegan. I'm on the committee on LCF, and I've been working very closely with Thomas. He actually wrote a fantastic 15-page critique of that consultation for the FCA. But I just want to touch on some of the social media stuff that's worked for LCF. It's definitely been Twitter, I would say. We've also worked closely with Jim Armitage at the Evening Standard, Caroline Binham at the FT, and James Burton in the Daily Mail. But I think when you're talking about the banks, and I have a very similar problem actually, Pauline, and we've been trying to sort out with the banks. They're also involved or facilitated the crime in this other case, unfortunately, and we were hoping they just sort of do the honourable thing and settle. But of course, you know, that they've argued they were in blissful ignorance, which really isn't much of a defence. So, you know, I'm very happy to connect with you, because we're actually having to sort of take matters a bit further. But one thing of hope, I think, is the APPG, the Fair Business Banking, and Kevin Hollingwake is setting up this Financial Services Tribunal, and that should give some hope, because the problem is it's like David versus Goliath. You've got these legal teams in these banks, and they're prepared to spend millions, and you've got you know, the poor victim who's up against them, and it's very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, happy to connect with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Please do. Making these connections is what it's going to take. Thank you very much indeed, Pauline. And then Helen. Is Mr. Paul Carlier still with us? I'm not sure if he is.
Yep.
Please go for it, Paul. Thank you.
I'd just like to follow up what Pauline was saying on two fronts, actually. That I've got evidence to show that 4 journalists that ran stories featuring evidence that I brought to them were, let's just say, suffered a retaliation by the FCA press office for having done so. One, and they're the only lines at the FCA that are not recorded are the press office lines. One journalist who ran a story which basically exposed, featured a statement that the FCA had put out that the evidence I'd given the journalist proved was false. The FCA press office, within 2 days, were trying to get her sacked, having trawled through her Twitter account to find a controversial tweet that she'd liked, and they tried to get her sacked. Now, and 2 other journalists have, let's just say, been faced with unhelpful responses by the FCA when they've gone, after publishing a story that was critical of the FCA, gone back to the FCA for a follow-up story or on something else, and received no cooperation or information whatsoever. And obviously, this is a problem because their careers depend on access to the FCA. Yeah. So, it's a major problem and one that needs to be looked at. The other one, the LCNF scandal, I don't know if anyone's seen, I've just posted a link up there, but I was working in an office in London next door to what turned out to be a boiler room pushing a mini bond product called the Blackmore bond in 2017. And I emailed the FCA to report this, what they were doing. I reported everything they were saying, everything they were promising, and the fact they were clearly targeting pensioners. And the FCA never got back to me. They assured me they were taking it seriously. This was March 17. It collapsed early this year, and there's 45 million of pensioner money that has been lost, or is potentially lost, because it's, the administrators are trying to locate it where it is. And much of that was invested after March 17 when I reported it. And the FCA claimed that they could do nothing because it fell outside of their regulatory perimeter. But on LCNF, they said there was nothing they could do because the only thing that fell within their perimeter was the marketing. Well, everything I reported to them was the marketing. They were guaranteeing 9.9% annual returns. They were saying the principal was guaranteed by one of the world's largest banks. And what part of that isn't marketing? So, and the FCA have gone to extraordinary lengths to try and deflect blame and not accept any responsibility whatsoever.
Absolutely amazing. I'm gobsmacked. Somebody said that saying in one of our events a couple of months ago. I still can't quite believe it, but there's no reason to disbelieve this person at all. He basically said that another regulator outside the UK warned the FCA about what looked like suspicious, dodgy activity going on. It would appear as though the FCA ignored it. Net result, loads of people ended up losing their life savings because this turned out to be the scam that the other regulator thought it was. What's going on? One wonders. What's going on? Mr. Philip Meadowcroft, your turn.
Thank you, Andy. I've got to leave now. I just want to congratulate you on chairing the very, very best symposium after I must have been around for 4 years on this that I've ever attended. Revelatory in many respects, both at the micro level and at the macro level. I think that there's not a moment of this last couple of hours that I wouldn't want to hear many times again. And I hope you're able to impart most of this, in fact, all of this, to the kind of authorities that you are in touch with. Well done indeed for a brilliant, brilliant symposium.
Philip, thank you very much indeed for those very, 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 very kind words. If we're good at anything, it's just rounding people up. That's all we do well. We just round up the right people for the right reasons in the right way. And you are all the people with the input. Thank you very much for your very kind comment.
Round up a few bankers and regulators as well.
There we go. Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you. I think Mr. Stan Kings wanted to say something. Stan, please do. I know that your own case is tortuously difficult. I think I'm describing it well there. Stan, please briefly introduce yourself. We are going to be a bit short of time, so as succinctly as you can, please share the point that you would like to. Thank you.
First, may I kind of thank you for inviting me tonight. I know it's probably a banking situation you were talking about tonight. I'm shared the interest very much so. I'm very much kind of moved by Robert Delner's situation, which I can relate to. As you know, I've had problems with the taxman for the last 20 years. I seem to be fighting a one-man battle, and I feel that the regulator, being the tax tribunal service, won't even engage in conversation with me. The taxman has told me that I've exhausted their complaint system and should be referred to the Ombudsman. I wrote to the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman's given me a form for my MP to sign and send back, and it don't look as if he wants to do it, because he's had it for a little while now and he hasn't even sent it back.
I know.
I could see I was almost in tears with Robert Delner at the time. It just moved me. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan, for sharing your thoughts. I think you're not the only one.
I'm not afraid for any of what I say to go on in public or to the media. I want the media to know my case, and I feel it's the only way I can probably get justice is by the media getting involved.
I think you're probably right. I know you're being pushed from pillar to post to pillar to post. It's amazing you're even sane.
I've been to the local newspaper thinking I could get to a national newspaper, and you might sit in an office. I've done it a couple of times now. A young girl comes out and she speaks to you, and they really don't want to know about a tax problem until you've won your case. And I felt I've won my case, but I can't get it over the line.
Yeah, I know. It is. God, I wish I was a wealthy person. If I had loads. If I had loads of money, I'd hire a whole load of bleeding lawyers to go and help people like you, Stan. That's all I do with it. That's all. It breaks my heart when I read the emails that you send me. It really breaks my heart, Stan. From you and your wife. I can't stand it. It's driving me frigging nuts.
We've both been, we've both been accused of tax evasion. And we haven't even committed the crime, although I've been fined for doing so. Yeah, I can't seem to be able to get even to the Ombudsman now, because my MP, who is a barrister and Queen's Counsellor, he's almost trying to cover up for the mistakes that have been made in the tax system.
I know, Stan. I know. Stan, thank you for sharing your point. We're going to be wrapping up very shortly, folks. Greg, I think you've got your finger up. Yes, you have. Greg, please share.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Sorry, a brief couple of comments in response to several recent speakers. So I mean, I really take that point on board about, what chance have you got against these organisations? I mean, the average big bank has 2,500 lawyers working for them, internal lawyers, and I've done some work with them, and they it would be. You can imagine that their management will want to defend themselves. Therefore, this is the wrong approach. The right approach is definitely also not to wait for prosecutors to bring cases, to impose fines, and to take individual directors to court and so forth, because we all know it takes way too many years to lay that level of evidence down, have that case go through, and by then those people have, to be honest, retired rich. So it is academic. What we need to do, I would suggest, is to change culture, change attitude. So the US approach is renowned for being heavy-handed on litigation and finance penalties. But actually, I think the truth is far more interesting, that they are heavy-handed on the ability to get in there and prove enough to the board that they're in deep trouble, and therefore they don't need to wait for a court case. They don't need to lay down that many years of litigation and leading up to that. What they need to do is they need to convince that company it needs to change its ways. And what we're talking about now is culture change. And the culture change can be reinforced, as was discussed earlier by HSBC's case. Yeah, 1.593, whatever it was, $1 trillion fine. But the point was it was a deferred prosecution, and they got 5,000 staff, certainly 500 staff. I apologize, I can't remember too long ago. Staff appointed, agreed by the regulator to be embedded into the organisation to trawl over it and ensure that its standards were held to account and that their culture changed. And part of that, every member of staff who was involved in any of the affected business areas or future improvement areas had to read a very, very brief 2-page summary by the regulator to say how badly that firm had done, how many money laundering cases they had done, not just in the US, but in many other countries. And it laid it on the line that we have a bad culture. We need to change our culture. That is what we need to do. And we are going to have internal police appointed by external people that will have, higher authority than your chief executive to monitor, to control, to reinforce a sense of values, a sense of attitude and culture change, top to bottom, right? The bottom level staff needed to read this particular document. There was no pretense that the bank had not done wrong. I think that is a much better way than litigation because it's years, half a decade quicker in terms of turnaround, and it has a much more ingrained ability to improve culture change within an organisation. So sorry if I've gone on. There were several other things, but one other, sorry, revolving doors. Yeah, so the FCA have no teeth because they pay peanuts to people who want to be back in the city, and therefore they won't shout out about it. There are actually a number, I know at least one very, very able FCA regulator who is, his heart is in his job. He wants to do well. He wants to change it internally. And he does a very good job, and he will never go to a bank. That is an individual. But the system needs to recruit investment bankers who want to be poacher-turned gamekeeper, not they're in between jobs and they want to have regulator on their CV and they want to move back to another bank. That is not teeth. Sorry.
Thank you very much indeed. You shared several very, very powerful points there. It's interesting, isn't it? A few years ago, when I think Martin Wheatley was either around or on his way out, there was a project all about the FCA opening a big project about looking at culture in banking. And for some reason, it was decided to be kicked into the long grass, and it's never happened since. Thank you, Greg. I think Helen's raised her hand again. Helen, have you raised your hand again? Thank you.
Yes, I did. Just very quickly. Nice to see you, Greg, because Greg and I used to work at HSBC. Do you remember, Greg?
Helen, hello! Oh God, yeah, hi. Lovely to see you.
I mean, actually, I remember Greg.
We sat next to each other for
we
like
did.
6 months. Yeah.
You were on a motorbike. I remember you came in this motorbike and you called me from a motorbike going at 90 miles an hour.
Harley Davidson top. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I did a backfire on my last day out of HSBC Global Liquidity that day. That's right.
No, it was great.
I think you probably heard it through the windows. It was a very loud backfire.
Yeah. But I just actually want to echo, in fact, what Greg said. In fact, revolving doors is something I was going to mention, but Anthony Stansfeld has done exactly that, and I think he's got some fantastic videos. He's a great guy, somebody who has integrity and seems to be independent, and so many people don't have that. I don't have that courage. I was just, the other things I was going to mention was I do rate Anthony Townsend. Unfortunately, he's left. He was the independent complaints commissioner, and some of his complaints were very good, where he really did stand up against the FCA. I just want to mention also the UK corruption website, which Nicholas Wilson, he's another whistleblower, and he's set up, and I've got an article about my, I think I sent it to you, Andy, about this huge scam that nobody's investigated. And the other thing about Michael with the tax problem, is it Michael with tax problem? I think the APP, who is it?
It's Stan Kings with the tax
problem. Stan's got the tax problem. Yes, so the APP, the loan charge action group and the APPG on that, there was some fantastic documents they did about HMRC and about the problems within HMRC. So I don't know if Stan's looked at those, but I think they're very, very useful. And some of the MPs involved in that would be worth hooking up to, I think, connecting with. That was it, but thanks very much, Andy. Very good symposium tonight. Very excellent. And,
you're most welcome. You really are most welcome. Folks, we're going to bring it to a close there. Let's do what we can. I don't really know what to say. I'm not speechless, but I'm thinking to myself, where the hell do we begin? It's got to make sense to parade the problem by trying to get the media involved. It's got to make sense to try to engage with politicians, policymakers and regulators who do want to make a difference. And it's got to make sense to carry on trying. And sometimes doing what we're trying to do requires a little bit of courage. I've had a few conversations in the last few years where I've had to kind of, build up my courage before having the conversation and saying what I was about to say. But the single most important thing from today, from my personal point of view, is to think about the courage, frankly, that Paul Moore showed in what he did. He's an example. Robert and I have already spoken about an idea, which is to have a special event all about Paul's book. So the book he wrote, Crash Bank Wallop, is going to be the subject of our first ever book review. So people like Robert, myself and others who are interested can kind of gather in a Zoom room like this and talk about the book and what it's helped us to understand. I see that Andrew Candy at least has put his thumbs up to that. Folks, thank you very much. We need to bring it to a close now. Please get in touch if you've got any loose ends.